Brilliant scholars of religion. We are now going to start a new lesson plan, and this lesson plan is on Judaism, or Judaism, you could say it either way. And to begin, I'd like to say shalom, which means peace, and that's the greeting. And let's go to the share screen, and let's click on that and open it up. So here is our lesson plan on the Jewish traditions. And I will walk you through. The problem with this is that I only have 30 minutes to cover a lot. So I'm going to introduce you to Judaism and the symbols, the terms, the numbers, the branches, the dietary laws, all of this kind of interesting general information. This is where it gets tricky, is the history goes back 4,000 years, and then I'm only going to be looking at the first 2,000 years from 2000 BCE, which is 4,000 years ago, to the first century. And then the Jews are in what's called diaspora. That is, they're out of their Holy Land for 2,000 years until 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. So this is a lot of history, a lot of material that may be totally unfamiliar to you, and I'm only going to talk about the highlights, because there's no way you can cover 2,000 years in a few minutes. So here we go. So Judaism. I have two symbols here. One is the Star of David, also called the Shield of David, which is recognized as a more modern symbol of Judaism. And this is the menorah, and the menorah has the various candles on it. And these are very famous, well-known Jewish symbols. The word Jewish is interesting because the word itself comes from the name of a tribe. In Judaism, we'll learn that there are 12 recognized tribes of Israel, and 10 of those tribes were called the 10 lost tribes. We don't know what happened to them. It's a northern part of the tribes were living in the northern region. And a group called the Assyrians came in, and they either wiped them out, assimilated them. We're not really sure what happened to those 10 tribes, but the two tribes that were remaining in the southern part of the kingdom was the tribe of the Benjaminites and the tribe of Judah. And from those two, the tribe of Judah survived. And so we get the word Jewish from the tribe of Judah. So I think that's kind of an interesting etymology of that word there. The numbers and the locations. The numbers, it's not a huge world religion, but it is a very significant world religion because it lays the foundation for Christianity and Islam. They're all three historically and theologically connected. But in terms of its numbers, it's quite small in number, and it's about, the numbers can vary between 15 and 16 million, but it said that before World War II, the numbers were up to 18 million, and then with the sad case that happened in World War II with the Holocaust, 6 million had lost their lives, and then it's regained a little bit, but not back to the pre-World War II numbers. So it's still not that large in that sense. In terms of locations, the locations are found all around the world, of course, but there's two central areas that you're going to find it. One is going to be the United States with about 6 million, and the other would be Israel with the other 6 million. And that constitutes about 12 million, and then make up the other 3 million located in various locations around the world. So for instance, I think Canada, and France, and other locations are kind of next in the numbers, but the US and Israel would be the two big places. In terms of the US, you're going to find it more on the East Coast and more on the West Coast, and not so much Middle America. Okay, so the main branches, there are a few mentioned here. Let's jump right to the end and talk about the non-practicing Jewish people. And these are Jewish people that recognize Judaism as a family lineage, recognize it as historically connected to it and genetically connected to it, because there may be kind of like a family line there, but do not practice it, do not believe in it, are themselves agnostic/atheists. How could you be Jewish? And you're saying, well, isn't that a religion or is that ethnicity? It's a little of a blurry line there, because yes, it's both a religion. Yes, people can convert to it. And yes, it's also through your family line. So you can literally be considered Jewish and not be in any way a religious person. There are very famous non-practicing Jewish people that are recognized in Judaism, and an example would be Albert Einstein, who himself was a non-practicing, self-declared atheist/physicalist, meaning he only recognized the physical world and nothing in metaphysical terms. So there are well-known non-practicing Jewish people, and there is a big percentage of that 15 to 16 million on the planet that fit into that category, and it's quite large. It's I don't want to give an exact number, but it's up there. It's a very significant number of that. And then in terms of Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Reform Judaism, these are going to be the three big branches. And Orthodox Judaism is going to be the most ultra-conservative. They, you even have a subdivision of it called Hasidic Judaism, which is a subdivision of the Orthodox. And let me walk you through what each of these are. So the Orthodox Judaism, somebody from that lineage or that background, will take the material from the Hebrew scriptures. They would not call it the Old Testament. That's a Christian reference. They would take the material from the Hebrew scriptures, and we'll go through what the Hebrew scriptures are in a minute. But they take that material and they take it literally. So as it's being written and as they're reading it, they're taking that literally, not symbolically. And so there's no room for interpretation or symbolism. So they are considered biblical literalists. Their language that their services are in Hebrew. The males and the females sit apart. The rabbis are always males, and they definitely follow a very strict kosher diet, and I'll talk about kosher rules in a minute. The conservative Jews, it sounds like conservative, but it's kind of more, you can use traditional Jews as well, but they're definitely less conservative than the Orthodox. So the conservative Jews, they allow for biblical scholarship. They allow for research and symbolism and reinterpreting the scriptures in light of modern understandings and so forth. So they work with modern scholarship. Their services are in Hebrew, but the males and females can sit together. They follow the kosher diet, but not as strict. And that represents the conservative. Both for the Orthodox and the conservative, you are Jewish if your mother is Jewish. And if your mother is not Jewish, but your father's Jewish, you're not under that Jewish fold. And why not? Why does it have to come through the mother? And it's always argued because we know who our mothers are. We hope we know who our fathers are, but we know for sure who our mothers are. So it's that whole line of thinking that, I guess in tribal times with, the tribal warfare, you don't 100% maybe know your father. So it's kind of carried over from that concept. And then Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism definitely works with modern scholarship, absolutely. They also recognize mother or father as constituting the child as being from a Jewish background, so it's either or. Their services are in English or whatever language of the people, the vernacular of the people. And kosher diet is optional. Okay, some people follow it, some do not. They all honor it, but they don't necessarily require to follow it. And in Reform Judaism, males and females sit together. I think I hit the main points there. So it's definitely a more modern approach. It is from more the current times. The Reform Judaism is more like a early 20th century movement and very popular in America. So the Hasidic Jew fits under the Orthodox Jew. The actual word means the pious ones or piety. They have much more of a kind of a mystical, very Orthodox, true, but more kind of a mystical approach, seeing God as immanent in the world. And there's a famous quote of theirs, like, there's no place he isn't. There's no place that's devoid of him, because God is everywhere. It's almost a pantheistic, and we just have to open up our minds to that and so forth. So the Hasidic, you might have seen Hasidic Jews with kind of, sometimes they wear the black hat and the curly sides here and the longer beard. So the Hasidic Jews will be introduced to you, I think, in I'm trying to see if I have a film connected to them, but if not, maybe I can put one up because they're very interesting. The Kabbalist Judaism is the mystical form of Judaism, just like we finished studying Sufism for Islam. Here we have this Kabbalist, really goes back at least 500 years. And the Kabbalist Jews really have a meditative, mystical approach, and they believe in reincarnation, which is quite interesting, and believe in meditation and this whole connecting back, waking up to your inner self and all of that. So it's kind of a beautiful mystical branch within Judaism. So I'm just giving you the highlights here, and then we'll talk about kosher rules. So as I mentioned, the Orthodox follow a very strict kosher diet, conservative, not as much, but definitely, not as strict, I should say, but definitely follows it in the Reform. It's optional. So for the kosher diet, a lot of students find this quite interesting, and so much so that there's a little small film if you want to open it up and learn more. But the kosher diet is certain foods cannot mix, because in the Hebrew scriptures it mentions that, so they follow that diet. And specifically, meat has to be removed from any form of dairy. There can be no mixing on your plate. no mixing in your dishes. The actual silverware has to be different silverware, the plates, the pans that you cook it in. You can't, for instance, let's imagine what you would make with dairy and meat. You might make, I don't know, meatballs with Parmesan cheese inside them, or you might make a cheeseburger, or you might make pepperoni pizza. All of that is not acceptable in the kosher diet. So anytime you're mixing dairy with meat, and it's unacceptable. There's some kind of passage in the Hebrew scriptures about like the mother's milk should not be mixed with, you know, the meat of the mother kind of thing, or the child, or anything like that. The mixing of the mother's milk with the actual meat product is unacceptable to them. And the Orthodox and the very, very conservative / Orthodox might have different refrigerators for dairy and meat, might have different dishwashers for dairy and meat, might have different, I think they even walk you through in that little film that they show you examples of that, different whole plate system and a whole different pan system. Just everything in the kitchen is separated in that sense. So another thing about the kosher rules is that you cannot have, you cannot eat animals who, their qualifications to eat the animal has to have split hooves, okay, here's my Spock here, and chew their own cud. And so chewing their own cud, some people say, what's that? It's when the animal eats, and then it brings it back into its mouth, it regurgitates it back and then re-chews it. So they chew their own cud and they have split hooves, and then they can be eaten. So animals that don't fit that qualification, as example, is a pig. Pork is not accepted under the kosher rules. Another example of what cannot be eaten in the kosher rules when you get to the sea life is it has to have scales and fins, and then that fish can be eaten. So for instance, like halibut has scales and fins, but then you couldn't eat like lobster because it doesn't. So you can't eat shrimp and you can't eat oysters because it has to have scales and fins. So there's kosher rules there that are explained and where they're getting those from the Hebrew scriptures. So let's talk about the Hebrew scriptures. The Jewish scriptures, we're going to talk about, I actually am missing a word here and I'm going to add it. It's Tanakh. So when we talk about what a Christian might say the Old Testament, but in Judaism, you'd never say that. You'd say the Hebrew scriptures. And the Hebrew scriptures consists of 3 parts. It consists of the first 5 books that make up the Bible. The first 5 books, a lot of people are familiar with, but it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books. And that really goes back to 4,000 years ago from the Jewish perspective, not the academic perspective. The academic perspective might say, we can't verify any of these stories 4,000 years ago. But from the Jewish perspective, it goes back 4,000 years in their history. And those first 5 books start with the story of Adam. And then eventually it's going to talk about Noah. And it's eventually going to talk about Abraham, and eventually talk about Moses, and etc., and David and Solomon, etc. So that is referred to, those first 5 books, is the Pentateuch, because Penta means 5 in Hebrew, Penta. And the first 5 books, it's also referred to as the Torah. So the Torah is the Pentateuch. And in addition to the Torah Pentateuch that makes up the Hebrew scriptures, it's the book of prophets and the book of writings. Those 3 together, the Torah / Pentateuch, the book of prophets and the book of writings, those 3 together make up what's called in Judaism the Tanakh, which is their Hebrew scriptures. It's the Jewish word for the Hebrew scriptures. Missing here, I will pop that in. The Talmud is not the Hebrew scriptures, it's like commentaries on them. It's more kind of like, remember in Hinduism, we have the Vedas and then we have the commentaries on them, which is the Upanishads. It is commentaries on them and how to live like a proper Jewish life, and how to, the Jewish laws and so forth, how to follow through with those and honor them. The author of the Torah is what I want to talk about for a minute. The author of the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, instead of saying it's Moses, that would be, the old traditional believers' perspective, because they're called the books of Moses. There's a problem with that from an academic perspective, and the problem primarily is that in the book of Deuteronomy, in one of those 5 books, the last of the 5, Moses dies. The character Moses dies, and so how can he die and be the author of that book? So certainly that set the biblical scholars back in the 18th century kind of to reinvestigate, who really then is the author. And they concluded through what's called literary research and analysis, where they investigated the different styles of writing, the different references to God, the different themes within them, they concluded that there wasn't one author, but multiple authors. And the multiple authors are referred to as J, E, P, and D. J is the authors that refer to God as Yahweh, and because J is Y in German, I hope I said that right. And E is the authors that refer to God as El Shaddai, or El Olam. And P are the priestly writers that write all the priestly rules, and D is the authors of the book of Deuteronomy. So these 4 different groups are considered the authors of the Pentateuch, or the Torah. And that is just a really different perspective than, let's say, the old classic believers' perspective prior to academic research, prior to biblical scholarship, which really goes back to Germany and really goes back to a couple hundred years ago. Prior to that, everybody said it was Moses as the author, and now we have a completely new understanding. So let's move here and to the holy days. So for Jewish holy days, we have Yom Kippur, with Hanukkah, Bar Mitzvah and Bat Mitzvah, Passover, or the Seder meal, the Sabbath, and Rosh Hashanah. So Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Think of it as a one-day-long Ramadan, where you're fasting all day. It's a day of atonement, lots of prayers, and then it ends with a family meal. Hanukkah is, we think of Hanukkah around the Christmas holidays. I'm sure a lot of people connect it to that time period, but Hanukkah is translated as the Festival of Light. And there's a story in Judaism how when the Jewish people were able, there was a group of brothers were able to recapture the temple, and this is about 165 BCE. It had been taken over, and they were able to come in and recapture it. They lit some candles in the temple, and those candles remained lit for 8 days, and there was only enough oil in the candle, what do you call that, the lamp, I guess, to remain lit for a few hours. So they considered it a miracle and a sign that God was helping them. So that's referred to as Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. Bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah is the rites of passage that a young male or female enters into adulthood, and bar mitzvah is for the boy, and that's at 13. Bat mitzvah is for the girl, and that's at 12. They argue that girls mature a little earlier. And Passover and the Seder meal. So Passover is a very well-known Jewish holiday, and it's in honor of the story of Moses, and when, from their perspective, not from the academic, we'll challenge that later, but from their perspective, that God leads the people out of slavery and out of Egypt, and in so doing, he sent these plagues that fell upon those that captured them, the slave owners or what have you, and the Egyptians. And one of them was the angel of death, which was passed over the houses of those that had the blood of the lamb on the door. And those that didn't have it, their firstborn male child was killed. And so it's the story of the Passover, the angel of death. It's kind of a sad story. I have a hard time with that concept of the angel of death taking firstborn. But nonetheless, it's their way to say that God intervened in history to help them, is how they're viewing it. Now, Sabbath is their holy day of the week, and it's when the sun goes down on Friday night till the sun goes down on Saturday. So it's that whole Saturday. And the Rosh Hashanah is their New Year, the Jewish New Year. So political issues, so just kind of going through the highlights here. So as we talked about, Judaism has 4,000 years of history. And I forgot what time I started my talk, but I want to make sure I cover it in 30 minutes. So they have 4,000 years of history. And for the first 2,000 years, there's so much of that we don't know. We don't know historically if all of that happened, if there was an Abraham, if there was, I mean, some people question, was there even a David and a, Moses and all of that. So a lot of it is out of the realm of scholarship. A lot of it is just stories that they say they're oral stories that passed down in the Jewish families and later got recorded at a time when the Jewish people felt that they were going to be wiped out. It was around 500 BCE. I'm giving you just a very rough estimate. And they felt like, they were being captured, they were going to be wiped out, their temple was burned, they got to record their history or their stories. And so that's when we start getting the writings out of those oral stories. So a lot of it we don't know, but where am I going with this? So the Jewish people, their temple was destroyed twice, and on the second time it was destroyed was by the Romans in 70 CE. And when it was destroyed, they were pretty much kicked out of their homeland, and they lived in what's called the diaspora. And there was a movement to go back to their homeland, and that movement really started in the 19th century and really was strong in the 20th century. Albert Einstein was part of that movement. It's called the Zionist call, or a Zionist movement to go back to their homeland and, you know, reestablish, you know, their Jewish identity there. It wasn't honored until the Holocaust happened, when the United Nations said, in like the 1948, they decided, you know, let's honor the Zionist call. They've gone through so much with, you know, the tragedy of the Holocaust. And so we have the creation of the state of Israel. Problem was the Palestinians were living in that region, and that caused incredible tension between the Palestinians and the Israelis living there. And that tension is not fully resolved at all. There's the question mark of how to resolve it. Okay, now we're going to do the juicy stuff here. This is the tough stuff, okay, and then it ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the believer's perspective, and then when we go to the next lesson plan, which is on the topic of biblical scholarship, we're going to go into the more academic side. So realizing that this is how the Jewish people see it. They believe that God has intervened, use the wrong word choice, intervened in history to save his people, and they feel like they are the chosen ones. It's a whole concept to that. All the trials and tribulations and suffering they've experienced, a lot of it is a sign that, you know, God's paying attention to them, and God's testing them, and God's intervening on their behalf, and so forth. So a lot of the stories, there's a lot of tragedy that happens in the retelling of their stories. But that's called salvation history. Salvation history is the idea that God interacts through history. So a lot of the claims within Judaism are historical claims, but that's where scholarship comes in. Anytime it's a faith claim, a scholar can't say anything about it. A scholar can't test it, verify it, because it's based on a belief. But the minute you start making claims like so-and-so existed, this happened, this historical event, that historical, then the scholar, it's a kind of fair game, and the scholar can go in and say, well, did it really happen? Do we have any evidence for that? Is there any outside evidence besides just the believer story? And so that's where scholarship comes into play. And that becomes a little touchy for people, because people are sometimes used to their, you know, their portrayal of that historical event. So I'm going to portray it from the believer's perspective for this lesson plan, but in the next lesson plan, you'll bring up some challenges. So from the believer's perspective, it goes back 4,000 years to 2000 BCE, and they're going to start with Abraham as a founding father. Abraham is going to be recognized as the father of Isaac and also of Ishmael. Islam traces their lineage back to Abraham through his first son, Ishmael, and Judaism traces it back to his second son, Isaac, with the mother, Sarah. And it's said that Abraham made a covenant with God, and that covenant, a sign of that covenant, well, they would be the chosen people, and from his family line, the Jewish lineage would prosper. But part of that covenant was there would be a sign, a physical, objective sign that they were his people, and that would be circumcision. So Abraham has a son, and that's Isaac. And then Isaac has two sons in the famous story, as he has these two twin boys. One's Jacob and one's Esau. And eventually, I don't have time to go into it, but there's an intriguing story about these two brothers, and Jacob tries to trick his father into giving him an inheritance. And it's just a fascinating story. But nonetheless, Jacob, it said, he marries, and he has two wives. He has Rachel and Leah. And there's, again, an intriguing story. I can't pass it up. He's in love with Rachel, but the father, the daughter's father gives him Leah on his wedding night. He actually accidentally marries the sister. And he's like, but I was here to marry the love of my life, Rachel. And he goes, well, work for me for so much time and prove to me you're a good man, and I'll give you my other daughter. So he has these two sisters as his wives. And it's a tribal time when polygamy was common. And he also has two concubines. With these four women, he has 13 children. One of them's a girl, Dinah, and then he has the 12 sons. Well, out of these 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where I'm leading to that, the 12 tribes. Jacob's name is now changed according to God. He says, I will now refer to you as Israel, and out of you will be these 12 tribes of Israel. So then we're going to jump ahead, and we're going to go to about, when is this time period? This is about 200 actually years later, when from the Jewish perspective, there's the book of Exodus, where they start telling a story about Moses, and that the Jewish people are captured in slavery in Egypt. Now, I'll give you a hint on biblical scholarship. Biblical scholars would look and say, hey, do we have any evidence in the Egyptian records of that? And there isn't any. So that's an example of when scholars are going to like try to piece it together, actually, what really happened. That's why I say history versus symbolism here. But the argument is that Moses, making it short here, he is raised kind of as the Pharaoh's son, but eventually discovers he has a Jewish background, and he works to liberate the people from slavery and leads them out of Egypt. And there's the whole story of those plagues that I mentioned. And eventually the Jewish people are heading towards their promised land of which to establish their kingdom. And it's said that when they saw their promised land, they couldn't just run into it because it was already taken up by other tribes. They had to actually conquer those tribes. And when they did so, they were able to, it's the period of judges and conquest, they were able to go in and take the land eventually. Took like 200 years, but they took the land, and the land was divided up into those 12 tribes. And eventually they decided, hey, let's set up a king. Let's have a monarchy and unite all our tribes together. And so they did so, and the first king was King Saul, and the second king was David, and the third king was Solomon. So those are names you might be familiar with. David is said to have established the Jerusalem as its capital, and then Solomon was said to have created the temple of Jerusalem and created it and constructed it. So that was about 3,000 years ago, if you look at the dates here, 1020 BCE. But here we have a problem. The next, I think it's the next king after Solomon, it doesn't matter. So eventually we have a king come into play. I think his name is Rehoboam, and he overtaxes the people, and there's kind of division and protest. And so the kingdom decides to split into two. And once they split into two, they're now vulnerable to attack. They're now no longer united and strong. And the first attack happens, we're down here, in 722 with the Assyrians coming in. And they came into the northern part, and those are the 10 lost tribes. And then the southern kingdom was attacked by the Babylonians in 586. So there's a lot of time. There's like 200 plus, I mean, like a big chunk of time. I didn't do my math right, but a big chunk of time where the southern kingdom's doing well, but the Babylonians come in and they take over that area and they destroy the temple. It's burned to the ground. They're held in captivity for 50 years. But it's in this time period when Judaism, they start to write down their stories. They feel like they're going to be, taken off the planet. They also are influenced by a lot of the different memes that they're exposed to by the Babylonians. So they were exposed to the flood story, and there's a famous Babylonian flood story that's almost identical to the Noah story, and it's earlier than the Noah story, and it said that that story enters into Judaism through the Babylonians. And also the story of God creating the world in 6 days, resting on the seventh, is also very similar to a Babylonian story of creation. So these accounts that we have in the Hebrew scriptures, some of them have probably other origins, and that's fun to look at. And again, that's biblical scholarship. And after the Babylonians, 50 years later, the Persians come in and they're very open and tolerant. And they said, hey, let's help you rebuild your temple. And that's fascinating because that's when the Persian comes in, and King Cyrus, I believe it was, and they help him rebuild the temple. They brought in with them a religious influence of what's called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrian philosophy goes back to the Persians, and they're the philosophy that argues for God versus evil, like the God versus Satan kind of concepts, heavens and hells, and they argue for angels, and angels can intervene and help you. So a lot of these Zoroastrian ideas enter into Judaism because of that time period. And again, a little bit of academic stuff there. Then the Greeks come in, and eventually their temple is recaptured, and these brothers in 175, I said 165 earlier, it's 175 BCE, they come in, the Maccabean family, and they fight Antiochus, and they recapture their temple, and that's where we get the Hanukkah story. Then following them, we have the Romans come in, and the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 CE. The Romans felt like there was a Jewish group called the Zealots. They were the militant Jews that were fighting against Roman rule, and they were trying to overthrow Roman rule, and the Romans basically in retaliation burned down their temple, and it's never been rebuilt. The Temple of Jerusalem is a Wailing Wall. Here you see it down here, and it's never been rebuilt. We have three other groups, and then I'm going to conclude because I'm running out of time. three other groups in the 1st century, and we have the Essenes, which are kind of the mystical Jews. Remember, there's always kind of a mystical branch of every religion. We have the Kabbalist as well, but the Essenes were those that went off in the kind of the caves, and they're responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, we have the Pharisee Jews, which are interesting because they believed in life after death. They believed in resurrection of the dead. They believed in the day of judgment. All of those ideas enter into Christianity through Pharisee Judaism. The Sadducee Jews did not. They believed this earth is it. When you live, then you die. There's no afterlife. So it's interesting because this group of Judaism is non-religious. These are the mystics. These are what you would think of as like the connection to Christianity, and then the Sadducee Jews they follow the rules, they follow the rituals, but it's not about the afterlife, it's about here and now. So that's kind of interesting, an interesting group to look at as well. They're all fascinating. So I think I did it. I have no concept of how much time I took from you guys in this presentation. I'm hoping it's under 30 minutes. I'll find out once I stop sharing and close out. But thank you for watching, and we'll have one more lesson plan on Judaism. It's on biblical scholarship. So shalom, and thank you, and I'm ending. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.